the darkest moments in the press box, ranking Pitt's quarterbacks, ranking Pitt's offensive coordinators, and what's Pitt's position in the ACC. All that and more on the special Thursday edition of the Morning Pitt Mailbag here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. All right, welcome to the Morning Pitt, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. I'm Chris Peak from Panther-Lair.com. You know, see the website below, Panther-Lair.com. Remember, I always tell you, don't click on that website below because that's not a link. That's just a picture. But you can type those letters into your browser bar and you will go to the most comprehensive source of Pitt sports news on the internet. Football, basketball, and recruiting covered all at Panther-Lair.com. And, of course, message boards to interact with hundreds and thousands of other Pitt fans. Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. That's the place to be. If you're a Pitt fan, you're looking for Pitt sports news and interaction and communication and contact and community and all those things, that's the place to do it. Panther-Lair.com, and you know our video side here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. You want to make sure you like this video and subscribe to the YouTube channel so you never miss any of our exclusive Pitt video content. These daily morning Pitt videos that we put out Monday through Friday, the live Panther-Lair show we do every Wednesday night, like last night. We do it every week at 8:30 p.m. Me and Jim Hammett get together and talk Pitt sports with you, your comments and questions. And then anything else we might have, prospect interviews, player interviews, press conferences, highlights, all these different stuff. We have it all at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. You don't want to miss it. So make sure you like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Now, you know, we typically do our mailbag edition of the Morning Pit on Fridays, but we switched it up a little bit this week, got something different planned for tomorrow. So we're going to do the mailbag on Thursday, and fortunately, we were lucky enough to have a lot of Pitt fans on Panther-Lair.com submit questions. So we got a lot to get through, really starting with last week. We had a few questions left over that we didn't roll through. And so I want to get a couple of those from last week and then move on to some great questions that came in this week. And Jay Lazinger has a question that's pretty relevant to some of the things we've been talking about this week with regards to Pitt recruiting. He asks, or they ask, is it just me or does it feel like Pitt has leveled up in the type of recruit they are finalists for? I realize we still lose guys to Michigan State, Purdue, etc., but it seems like there are more top-tier players that end up at Michigan or wherever now. To that point, you know, that's something we talked about earlier this week. I think it was the Monday edition of the Morning Pit. It was titled, Where Have All the Four Stars Gone? You know, and it wasn't just a Peter, Paul, and Mary reference or whoever sang Where Have All the Flowers Gone or whatever. But, you know, the reality is, and I've tried to make this point on the message boards, and I understand the pushback, but I still keep making this point that, you know, if you look at June and all the official visitors they brought in, they had 14 guys come to campus for official visits, 14 prospects who were four-star recruits. And if you compare that to the previous 4 Junes of 2020, you know, last June, 2022, the June of 2021, June of 2019, and June of 2018, couldn't have any official visits in 2020, so that doesn't count. But those other 4 Junes, they had a total of 21 four-star recruits visit. So 21 in 4 years versus this year 14. That right there is a leveling up. No matter what else we say, and there's a lot more to say to it. There's a context, of course, to add to it, but that is a leveling up. You know, they had 6 4-star or 5-star recruits visit last year in June. They had 6 the year before, 7 in 2019, and 2 in 2018. And they've had 14 on campus in June this year. Now, they didn't get all of those guys. And you're right. And everybody out there who wants to be just, the results are all that matter, and we're not going to look at any context or, pay any attention to what the recruiting process is. It's either you get them or it doesn't matter. You're right. Coffee's for closers. You're right about that. And I said that on Monday as well. It said it matters a whole lot less if you don't get those guys to commit. Obviously, the ultimate goal is to get those guys to commit, and just getting them to visit is not really winning the war, but it is winning some battles. And if you think of recruiting as sort of a process of steps forward in momentum and improving and recruiting at a higher level, you might not just jump from 0 to 60 in 1 year. It might take a little time. Now, I still think they're going to finish with more 4-star recruits in this class than Pat Narduzzi has ever signed. That will be a step forward, right? They've got more 4-star recruits taking visits than Narduzzi has ever had. That's a step forward, right? they are leveling up. And I think they're getting a lot of guys who have really good offer sheets. They're losing out on guys who have really good offer sheets. Sure, they lost a kid to Purdue, but we talked about that with Coy Beasley, about why he probably picked Purdue and kind of what made Purdue more attractive for a 4-star defensive back recruit than Pitt. But overall, I think they are recruiting at a higher level. I think you're absolutely right, Jay Lazinger. I think they have leveled up in their recruiting. Now, the next step is to keep landing more and more of those guys. But if you kind of take what I would say is a realistic approach to the whole thing, or a realistic perspective, and say they probably weren't going to go from 0 to 60 in 1 year, that it might take a little time to keep building that momentum. I mean, reality is they won 20 games over the last 2 years. That's great. We all know that. We have all talked about that. But the year before that, they went 6-5. The year before that, they went 7-7. The year before that, 5-7. The year before that, 8-5. The year before that, 8-5. The year before that, 6-7. The year before that, 7-6. The year before that, 6-7. The year before that, 8-5. We have to go all the way that far back to get to another 10-win season. And so, yes, the last 2 years have been very, very successful. And I think they are reaping the benefits of that success with the recruits they're getting on campus and some of the commitments that they're getting. But you're not going to erase 10 years of 6 to 8 wins every year by winning 11 and then 9 in 2 years. You're going to reap rewards from the success they've had the last 2 years. And I think the rewards they're reaping is the commitments they've gotten this year and all the visitors they've gotten. If you want to close on more of those high-profile guys, those top targets, you need to keep winning. They need to keep sustaining the success. And I think if they have another year where they, if they come out of 2023 season, you say, wow, they won 30 games in 3 seasons, then yeah, I bet they're going to get a bunch of 4-star guys on campus again next June, and they're probably going to land even more of them than they did this year. I think it's progressive. I think it builds. And I think it has been building, and I think some of the proof is in the pudding, even if there are people out there who only like Jell-O. Let's see. A.S. Daniels asks an interesting question. Says, under Pat Narduzzi, we originally thought we couldn't recruit defensive backs or defensive ends. Then we complained about offensive line and linebacker. In 2 or 3 years, what position are we going to look at and be surprised and say that is a great-looking position group we built? I mean, it's interesting that you say that early on they couldn't recruit DBs and DNs. I mean, I think, DBs right off the bat, they did pretty well recruiting them. I mean, Damar Hamlin was in that first full recruiting class. We didn't know it at the time of what these guys would become, but Patrick Jones and Rashad Weaver were in that first recruiting class. So I think they've done well at those spots pretty much since Narduzzi arrived. I would agree with you that there's been a leveling up with linebackers and offensive line, and we're seeing those positions really come into their own this year, I think, and some of the fruits of the recruiting is being borne out this year. I think the obvious answer a few years down the road, what you would like to see is looking back and saying, boy, actually, they have really turned it around with wide receiver recruiting. I mean, that's really tight end is always going to loom out there as the big hole, but, it's been 8 years now. I don't know if you're going to give up on it entirely, but I'm kind of setting that off the side, and whatever happens. But wide receiver is a position where you'd really like to see them upgrade the recruiting. They've had their hits. They've had more misses. They need to get some consistency out of the group. I think this last year's class of 4 guys, of Kenny Johnson and Lamar Seymour and Zion Fowler and Izzy Polk, I think it's a really intriguing group. I think they look like some good players in that group. I like Day Farmer. I like Cameron Montero, but they need to add 1 or 2 more guys in this 2024 class and keep building for 2025 and beyond. It's going to take a multi-year rebuilding project to put that room back together after it has largely fallen apart for a variety of reasons. But that would be the one that, at least as a Pitt fan or Pitt coach, you would hope you're going to look back in a few years and say, boy, they really turned it around with that position. Kurt46 says, is a hot dog a sandwich? Yeah, it is. There's no definite, this is a common question, but the reality is there's no definition of a sandwich that you cannot apply to a hot dog. However you want to define a sandwich, by whatever definition you have, and you can come up with any term you want, it can be applied to a hot dog and a bun. Ergo, a hot dog is a sandwich. I don't like it, but it's just the reality. Let's see, moving on, more questions here, some good ones. Rhino527 says, anything stand out as the darkest Pitt moment in the press box covering a game? Losing to Akron, Youngstown State, maybe Bowling Green after starting the season ranked? That's an interesting question. I think back, I've been covering this team since 2005. So I've seen my share of, are you kidding me, losses. In 2005, they lost to Ohio, and I was there for that game. 2006, the Rutgers game was a disaster. I mean, there were some bigger blowout losses. Louisville and West Virginia were both disaster losses that year at home. But the Rutgers game probably stung the most. 07 has its share. I mean, 08, the Bowling Green game. I mean, you could go on and on through the years. 2010 had a couple of nationally televised blowout losses in Miami and West Virginia. 2011, Todd Graham embarrassed himself 6 ways to Sunday. Paul Chryst obviously had the Youngstown State game in 2012. Nothing really in 2013. They were just mediocre again. 2014 had the Akron game and then the Georgia Tech game where they fumbled 6 times and then the Duke game where they missed the short field goal, all that stuff. Look, there have been plenty, all the way up through Western Michigan in 2021. In Georgia Tech last year. Honestly, Georgia Tech was one of the worst. But if you want to talk about darkness, if you want to talk about a hello darkness, my old friend moment, the one I would point to, more than Akron, Youngstown State, Bowling Green, Western Michigan, Georgia Tech, more than any of those, Connecticut 2007. All right. Oh, boy. It's tricky because the Navy game came after that, so maybe the Navy game. But I feel like the Connecticut game might have been, now I'm trying to remember which one it was, if it was Connecticut or Navy. It was one of those two. And I feel like it might have been Connecticut. And this was after they had the Virginia game. You remember they went on the road to Virginia. They tried to open the game with an onside kick, and it actually went downhill from there. Like, that was not the worst moment of that game. It actually kept getting worse. But I want to say, but it was either Connecticut or Navy, and I think it was Connecticut. Because at that point, things were going south in a hurry. And I mean, getting booed on their own home field. Kevin Smith, the quarterback, was getting booed. Pat Bostic, it was a home game. It was an empty stadium. I remember Hubie Graham, the tight end. You remember the tight end from Scranton? He ended up going to Illinois and then ended up transferring back to Pitt a few years later. It was pre-transfer portal. Hubie Graham was there. And pretty much, he was there on an official visit. And he pretty much eliminated Pitt because of the game day atmosphere. We often talk about attendance and atmosphere and all this stuff. That was a case where the game day atmosphere cost them a recruit. Now, that was a big part of why Hubie Graham picked Illinois over Pitt, is because of what he experienced that day. And I just remember the end of the game, after the post-game press conference, we're in the press box, and there was just a vibe in the press box that everyone felt like it just felt like you knew what was coming, that the end was near. It wasn't even the end of year 3 yet, but you felt like, this is it for Dave Wanstead. I feel like Paul Zeiss, actually, writing for the Post-Gazette, covering Pitt for the Post-Gazette at that point, in his lead of his game story, was something to the effect of the Pitt band should learn My Heart Will Go On, because it's the theme from Titanic and this ship is sinking. Like, that's a paraphrase, but it's not far off. That was, and he wrote that sitting in the press box that night. And maybe it was the Navy game. I'm pretty sure it was the Connecticut game. It was one of those two in 2007. And that was about as dark as I can remember it being, where there was just this cloud over everything of like, well, guess they'll try again. See if they can get a better hire this time, And that was, I think, I don't even know if Jeff Long was still there at that point. They might have had Donna Sanf as the interim AD at that point. Because Jeff Long had left for Arkansas. Steve Peterson wouldn't be hired until, the end of November. And that was an early season game. It was September or early October. That was one of the darker moments I can remember in the press box. It really was. This is interesting. Smedges says, how would you grade and or rank Pat Narduzzi's 5 offensive coordinators in game planning and adjusting the system based on the personnel, play calling and in-game adjustments, recruiting and scouting quarterbacks, and developing quarterbacks? This is interesting. There's some things that I don't really know. There's some that are kind of NA, not applicable on some of these. And quite frankly, some that are like, so if we talk about recruiting quarterbacks and developing quarterbacks, it's pretty tough to judge Jim Chaney on recruiting and developing quarterbacks when he was only here 1 year. Same thing with Matt Canada. I mean, he recruited Kenny Pickett, but a lot of guys recruited Kenny Pickett. Pat Narduzzi was strongly involved in that. And I don't know about Matt Canada developing quarterbacks, at least based on his time at Pitt, right? So it's hard to evaluate those guys on that. Sean Watson, even though he was here for 2 years as opposed to 1, like Chaney in Canada, I mean, it's hard for me to sit here and tell you how he was as a quarterback recruiter. I mean, it's not like they really signed anybody. He was here in 17 and 18, so I guess he would have signed. Nick Patty and Davis Bevel. So I guess he was good as a recruiter, but developing quarterbacks, it's hard for me to say because he had Kenny Pickett for 2 years. I guess Mark Whipple would be the best at developing quarterbacks just based on what happened with Kenny Pickett in his 3rd season working with him. They worked together for 3 years, and by the end of it, Pickett was a Heisman Trophy finalist. So I guess you would say Whipple was the best at developing quarterbacks based on what they did at Pitt. I'm not sure if there's anybody who really stands out for recruiting quarterbacks. In-game play calling, I think, was Matt Canada's forte. Play calling and in-game adjustments and probably game planning, but I'll get to that in a second. I think play calling, is where Canada was really, really good. And as a matter of fact, there's so much talk about Matt Canada in the city of Pittsburgh, and this has been this way for the last couple of years. And wherever I go, I end up getting in conversations with other, elementary school dads about sports, and we inevitably, football season, we talk about the Steelers, we talk about Matt Canada, we talk about Pitt and all this stuff. And the thing about Canada that I've always said and I've always felt, and this goes back to his time at Pitt, is I think he's really good at, or at least during his 1 year at Pitt, he was really good at calling a game. You know what I mean? And adjusting in a game and setting up a defense to get what he wanted and to confuse the defense and mess with what they were seeing and all these different. I think that was his forte. That was what he was really, really good at. And it was what made him great at Pitt. It was what made that offense have so much success, was the game, the play calling, and then obviously the execution of having all those senior offensive linemen and a 5th-year senior quarterback and a 4th-year senior running back and all this stuff. Game planning too, but what I've heard about Matt Canada is, obviously he was heavily involved in that, but it wasn't all him. He had a lot of people around him, GAs and other offensive staff that really contributed there. And a lot of times some of the game plan and scouting and whatnot wasn't really done by Canada as much as it was the people around him, and then he took the information that was produced and went out and put together the game plan and put the final touches on it, I guess, and then actually call the plays in the game. And that was where he really excelled. So I think he was the best at play calling. You have to give a credit. You have to give a nod at least to Mark Whipple for his final year when he, first Canada produced the most prolific offense in Pitt history. And then, 3 years later, or 5 years later rather, Whipple comes along and tops those numbers. It's funny, with a defensive head coach who's done so much to emphasize defense over the course of his 8 seasons, 2 of his 8 seasons have set records for scoring, set Pitt records for the most points, or most points per game in Pitt history. It's kind of funny how that works out. But as far as game planning, I really couldn't tell you. I'm not smart enough to know that. I think Mark Whipple probably did a great job at that and pretty good job play calling. I think, like I say, I think Canada was really good at calling plays. And I think there's some game planning there as well. GA Panther says, do you think roster moves are done for the 2023 season? Do you see any portal ads or people leaving? I know it's unlikely. Just want to see if our roster is what it is at this point. So I think they have about 3 open scholarship spots, I think. Unless I'm missing anything. It might be 2. I would imagine one of the punters, Jeff Urich or Caleb Junkel, will go on scholarship when one of them wins that starting job. So that would take one of the scholarship spots out. And then, let me skip ahead to the answer to your question. I don't see them adding anybody else. I could be wrong. We've seen late summer ads before, but just every day that passes, they're getting closer and closer to the start of training camp. They're getting, and it's less and less time for a new guy to come in and learn the playbook, offense, defense, special teams, whatever it may be. And so I think it's getting less and less likely that they're going to take anybody, that they're going to add anybody else to this roster. I also don't really see anybody leaving because you're pretty well past the point of leaving and being able to play somewhere else this season, unless maybe as a grad transfer you could go. But it seems like the roster is largely set. There might be one more addition, but I don't think it's going to be an impact player or somebody who's really going to change much for 2023. Famous last words, I know. All right, one more question. It's from Recruits Read These Boards. Says, we always discuss respect locally versus nationally, and we always agree where Pitt seems to have more national respect than locally. But I've noticed something else. Among the ACC community, they're almost dismissive of Pitt. Since Pitt joined the league, they're the only teams not named Clemson and Florida State to play in multiple ACC championship games. They're the only team to actually win. Have a Heisman finalist, not to mention the overall history, yet when poaching is discussed or when teams are ranked, Pitt is nowhere to be found. Why? When the Magnificent Seven was coined, Pitt wasn't on it, yet they've been more successful recently, have a better history, and even better attendance than at least 4 of those 7. What gives? I think there's a couple of things to discuss in there. One is sort of the respect among the ACC. And I think if you're Pitt, if you're Syracuse, if you're Boston College even, you're not in the triangle, and you're not Clemson, and you're not Florida State. I think there's a ceiling to the amount of respect you're going to get within the conference, despite your repeated success, despite being one of the more successful programs since joining the league 10 years ago. I think there's a ceiling to how much respect you're going to get if you're not in the triangle, if you're not part of that world. I think there's a ceiling to it, and I don't know if Pitt has hit the ceiling. They can probably get more. But I just... You pick up on a sense, and whether it's fans or it's media or it's whoever else, it's just a very closed... I don't want to say closed circle because it's a triangle, right? And it just kind of feels like you're either in it or you're out. I don't think Louisville is really in it. They've maybe basketball, but I mean, we're talking football wise. Louisville's not really in it. Virginia and Virginia Tech are in it because they've been around so long. Virginia longer than Virginia Tech. Virginia Tech because I think they all want Virginia Tech to be good. Same thing with Miami. I think the triangle, the ACC kind of lifers want Virginia Tech and Miami to be good. No matter how many times they let them down, they keep holding out hope for them to be good. I don't really feel like they're holding out that much hope for Boston College, Syracuse, Pitt, Louisville. I mean, it's just my sort of perception of it, being around different venues and different atmospheres and following different things. I just don't think they're not hoping for them to fail. And if they succeed, they will celebrate their success. But given the choice, there's like 7 other programs they would want to see have success before it got to Pitt and Boston College and Syracuse and Louisville. I guess 10 other programs, really, if you want to get down to it. As far as conference realignment stuff, I mean, we talked about that a lot when it was popular. And I mean, it's just a question of what you bring. Do you bring enough eyeballs and interest? And all the things you're mentioning there are true as far as where Pitt ranks on this list or that list, but do they bring enough eyeballs and interest? And I'm not sure if they do. So they often don't get included there with some of those name brand schools like Florida State and Clemson and even a North Carolina and a Miami. It's just to use a phrase that I always try not to use. It is what it is. And what this is the end of the Morning Pitt Mailbag. It's fun to do it on a Thursday, mix it up a little bit. I hope you got a chance to tune in. Remember, if you want to ask a mailbag question, you got to be a subscriber at Panther-Lair.com. You go to the premium message boards or Between Fifth and Forbes message board, and you can post a question there. When we put out the call for mailbag questions, if you have something you want to get answered, ask it there, and we will answer as many as we can. We got a few questions left over this week. We will get to those next week. That works out pretty well, doesn't it? Thanks so much for tuning in, though. We appreciate it. We appreciate everybody who submitted questions. Hope you've had a great week so far. Make sure you head over to Panther-Lair.com and get all the Pitt sports news and stay up to everything. And before you leave here, like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks again for tuning in. Have a great Thursday. We will catch up with you tomorrow for the Morning Pitt right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.